The very special guest, Mr. N.K. Singh, Chairman of the 15th Finance Commission, Government of India. It is really an honor, sir, to have you with us today. And now I would request Mr. N.K. Singh and Dr. Rajiv Singh, Director General, Indian Chamber of Commerce, to kindly come. I would request Dr. Rajiv Singh to kindly present Mr. N.K. Singh with the stole. Thank you so much, sir, for being with us this evening. And now I'd request Dr. Rajiv Singh to kindly deliver the welcome address.
Good afternoon, all. On behalf of Indian Chamber of Commerce, we would like to extend a very warm welcome to our chief guest, Mr. N.K. Singh, Chairman of 15th Finance Commission, Government of India. Mr. N.K. Singh, I'm sure he doesn't need any introduction. We have seen him in different avatars, and wherever he has been, he has left his mark. We all know him as a leader who has a vision. And whichever role he was in, he could create something which people remember and people talk about. And he has a new role and a very important role to play now, that is Chairman of the 15th Finance Commission. Sir, we are really honored and happy to have you with us. And our members are extremely keen to know about your thought process and how you look at the economic scenario, and within the framework of the Finance Commission, how things are going to be. I'm sure this audience would know the Finance Commission plays a very important role. It acts as an instrument to basically look at the distribution of proceeds of the divisible tax between the states and the central government. And the Finance Commission also determines the principles of governing the grant and aids of the revenues of states out of Consolidated Fund of India. Also, the Commission has the duty of considering any matter referred by the President of India in the interest of sound finances of the nation. The Finance Commission, which came into effect on November 27th, 2017, is in the process of consulting, taking inputs, interacting with the stakeholders, and then finally submitting their recommendations and suggesting the proposed model for the center and the states. You may be aware that there is an upward trend in the fiscal deficits of the states. The GST, which is a landmark reform brought in by the government of India, initially there were issues during the transition, but the revenues have already started showing an upward trend, and going ahead, it is likely, very likely, that the revenues are going to see a further rise. And the overall pie is going to increase with the more taxpayers or more companies and the traders getting into the tax net. So the issue of sharing the revenue and the model for overall finances of the nation and the states will come up, and that is where you need the Finance Commission to look at the optimal mix and the revenue sharing models. Let me also point out, because for East, again, this sector is extremely key, the power sector. The resource requirements of the power sector remain very high. In some states, the fiscal deficit with the power sector allocations have climbed to almost 8 to 9%. The public debt dynamics also need a serious relook and is a major concern. I think what I was also told, or I read, that the Niti Aayog has pointed out that social sector expenditure has increased only marginally since the 14th Finance Commission, despite an increase in total central transfers to the states by almost 21%. So I'm sure that is also something which is important, because the social sector spending also determines the welfare of people, and for the corporate sector, it also creates a market, more buying capacity, more purchase power in the hand of masses. I'll not speak further on this. I'm sure we are all keen to hear from our chief guest, Mr. N.K. Singh. So with these words, I would like to once again warmly welcome you, sir. And may I now request you to kindly address the gathering. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rajiv. Thank you for those warm words of introduction. But you cannot make me do what I precisely decided in my mind I wouldn't do. Of what is on my mind as far as the 15th Finance Commission, I would much rather that this be left to psychologists and astrologers on what sort of reward, award, recommendation the 15th Finance Commission is thinking of making. But I'm delighted to, and that is why actually when this request had come from the chamber, I had said that I want to select a subject far, far away from the 15th Finance Commission. I'm willing, of course, to answer questions and so on. And then the chamber debated with me a possible subject, and we agreed on the broad subject of democracy and development, which they felt was far, far away from the 15th Finance Commission, and for more reasons than one. First and foremost, the sheer propriety of it, because my major discussions with the Honorable Chief Minister of West Bengal is tomorrow, along with the state government. I've had, just before I came here, as I mentioned to you, Rajiv, very intensive discussions with leaders of all political parties in the state, with representatives from CPM, CPI, the Congress Party, the BJP, and so on, and of course the Trinamool Congress. We had a very healthy interaction there. And tomorrow, of course, I am eagerly looking forward to my interactions with the Chief Minister and her team. I'm having a formal press conference at the end of my dialogue with the state government, and that will be entirely on the discussions which I will be having with the state government on the 15th Finance Commission. Of course, if any of you are really bursting with the curiosity, I would be willing to answer one or two questions about the 15th Finance Commission and so on in the interactive session. Now, the reason why I have chosen to come to the Chamber of Commerce, the Indian Chamber of Commerce, in preference to many other similar competing requests, is because I have come to this chamber earlier, as you rightly pointed out, in my earlier capacities and the earlier hats I have worn. I found the audience to be acutely aware. I have enjoyed my interaction, and therefore I am delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be able to redeem a promise, because last year, after the thing was fixed, there was some personal event which took me back suddenly to Delhi, and I had promised to come back to the chamber. What better occasion than the occasion of the 15th Finance Commission? And so here I am in front of you. So let me speak a little bit about the theme which I had in mind, therefore democracy and development, and thereafter I would be happy to interact with you or with anyone which is here and asking questions, and I won't shy away from that and try and be as honest as possible. So why have I selected the theme of democracy and development? In a sense, this is a never-changing theme, because the ongoing debate between democracy and development has troubled political commentators for decades and analysts for decades, but a dialogue is a continuing, evolving one for several reasons. For one, because technology and interdependence of nations and social media manipulating our minds and choices has transformed the nature of this debate. So let me raise three important issues in this context, and after some comments we can have an interactive session. First and foremost, the conceptual one. What does development mean? How do we measure development? For a long time, traditional welfare economics had focused on income as a principal measure of well-being, till economic analysts and social scientists convincingly argued that poverty involved multiple deprivations. Poverty involved deprivations in terms of health and education, which could not be captured by raw poverty numbers alone, even though we recognize that many of these deprivations are a consequence of poverty. This altered approach, focused on capabilities, led to the United Nations Development Index, which is all about now changing its form into the UN Development Index, the famous UNDP report, which has also got metamorphosed into what is called Multiple Poverty Index, which develops and has evolved Millennium Development Goals and now Sustainable Development Goals. Nations now seek to improve their achievements on these Sustainable Development Goals, which measure poverty in a much broader sense of the term. Furthermore, measuring development also means recognizing freedoms, personal freedoms, freedoms of choice, freedom of thinking, freedom of action, and innovations as an inescapable factor of development. Connected with this more contemporary approach of measuring happiness, the Index of Happiness, which looks at development in a holistic sense. Inclusive development also recognizes that we need to ensure that the old, marginalized, and excluded groups, irrespective of gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and disability, have equal rights in society to benefit from the development process which is now embedded in our psyche. Inclusive development and policies and programs designed to achieve this is an integral part of the ease of living and integral to the Index of Happiness. Equally, what does democracy mean? The meaning and content of democracy itself has metamorphosed over time. The oldest known form of democracy, or a democratic kingdom, the Ganarajya, where a king was chosen by a people. People's votes can be traced back to 599 BC at Vaiji Vaishali, an ancient India not far away from my hometown in Patna. It was the birthplace of the 24th and the last Tirthankara of Jainism named Mahavir. The concept of democracy was further refined by Greeks and Romans and has seen multiple shapes and forms. History has also been a witness of profound tragedies that were the worst forms of atrocity have been committed in the name of democracy. Autocratic forms of dictatorship have also regarded themselves as being democratic. Terrible sins have been committed in the name of the people and for the people. However, to ordinary man, the three key ingredients of democracy which have come to be broadly accepted are three. First and foremost, free and fair elections. Electoral representation as a consequence of free and fair elections are embedded in institutions which are run on democratic principles and subjecting themselves to the precedents and to the practice of accountability. Second, a free and impartial judicial system which would independently pronounce on the appropriateness of the executive actions and decisions and its consistency with rules and regulations enacted through a due process by respective electoral representations to test whether these three links are central to democratic institutions, namely elected representation, or a parliament or otherwise, a judiciary, and the executive to act in harmony and in tandem. Third, and not unimportantly, all this was embedded in the freedom of thought, speech, and is a sense subjected to the scrutiny of an independent and a persistent media. The online internet version is a variant of the traditional media. The issue, however, of the newly evolving social media and its implications for any democratic rubric is an intricate subject. This deserves independent comments. The next question which I wish to raise is, then that's the second question, is the pursuit of democracy congruent to the pursuit of development? Is democracy central to development, or development a sine qua non for the survival of democratic institutions? The answer, I'm afraid, is a mixed one. It is congruent because no other institution except a democratic one guarantees freedom of thought and speech, the ability of free participation, formal and informal, of the people you seek to govern in the development quest than a democratic form of government. In this sense, notwithstanding perceived short-term conflicts, democracy and development are congruent in developing a democracy in a broader sense. But what are the conflicts, if any, between democracy and development? I perceive at least three complications. First, an intergenerational conflict. Electoral politics, which elect representatives for a limited period of 4 to 5 years. The election process and the choices need periodic renewal. Given the somewhat short-term horizon of elected representatives, there is an inherent conflict and a bias in favor of short-term solutions. Solutions which have some immediate gain, get a prospect of a renewal of electoral mandate. After all elected governments not only seek to survive, but seek to stay in office. And therefore, for instance, choices on macroeconomic policy, on fiscal prudence, on the allocation of resources between savings and investment, on decisions relating to consumption or investment, on exploitation of environment for immediate short-term gains versus long-term sustainable goals, represent these inherent conflicts. I suspect that they do, and how are these conflicts to be resolved in a democratic framework? If you overexploit, for instance, groundwater availability, or undertake the excessive use of fossil fuel, this compromises not only life quality of the existing generation, but it leaves diminishing resources for the next generation. Who is the best arbiter of intergenerational choices? If the compulsions of poverty elimination is an inescapable necessity for the present generation, does this entitle the present generation to overexploit the finite resources which would compromise the life quality of the next generation? How would these intergenerational conflicts be judicially reconciled? Second, how can democracy survive the onset of technology and the onslaught of technology? Not long ago, social media held out the promise of a more enlightened politics as accurate information and effortless communication helped good people drive out corruption, bigotry, and lies. Far from bringing enlightenment, social media is seen to be spreading in many countries unmitigated poison. Russia's troublemaking is only the start. From South Africa to Spain, politics is getting uglier. Part of the reason is that by spreading untruths and outrage, corroding voters' judgment, and aggravating partisanship, social media may end up in eroding the conditions for horse trading that are the sine qua non of exercising independent voter choice. Political scientists have long pointed out that social media make it easier for interests to organize. They give voice and power to people who have neither. For instance, they help to get Black Lives Better, a movement of fighting violence against African American ops, but research into another effects had just begun. Social media is also making politics and collective action more chaotic, argues in a recent book called Political Turbulence. Politics in the age of social media are thus better understood by chaos theory than by conventional social science. Collective action online is like a weather. Small events can have a big impact. The book's intriguing conclusion is that social media are making democracies more pluralistic, but not in the conventional sense of the word, involving diverse but stable groups. Instead, the authors see the emergence of chaotic pluralism, of which mobilizations spring up from the bottom. It would be wonderful if such a system helped wisdom and truth to rise to the surface. But whatever Keats had said, truth is not beauty so much as it is hard work, especially when you disagree with it. Everyone who has scrambled through the Facebook knows how instead of imparting wisdom, the system dishes out compulsive stuff that tends to reinforce people's biases. This is crucial because what is to be done? The social media companies should adjust their sites to make cleaner if a post comes from a friend or a trusted source. They could accompany the sharing of posts with reminders of the harm from misinformation, but they are often used to amplify, alas, political messages. Twitter could disallow the worst or mark them as such. Most powerfully, they could adopt their algorithms to put clock bit lower down the feed, because these changes cut against a business model designed to monopolize attention. They may have surpassed the law approved by the regulator. In other words, if the sine qua non of democracy is independent voter choice, but the mind is manipulated not by the freedom of individual choice, but manipulated by people who control the social media, would it be a happy state if we allowed, for instance, giant US tycoon companies like Twitter, Facebook, and Google to run and condition our minds, and therefore condition our thoughts, our action, in a manner which does not represent really our fundamental thinking? The third and last issue, and I'll stop there, the issues of legacy. Popularly elected governments often undertake decisions resulting maybe in fiscal profligacy, in excessive market borrowing, leaving behind an excessive pile of debt to successor governments. How will successor governments, and who is responsible in the successor government to discharge these debt obligations understood as legacy obligations? Those elected governments may have gone, but successive governments would suffer under the impact of decisions taken earlier. There cannot be a judicial recourse to this. Any ruler's bias must suffer from moral hazards. On the one hand, interfering and compromising with the mandate of a government in office, if its elected representatives choose to do so. On the other hand, what happens to the lingering impact of past decisions on the flexibility and freedom of choice of incumbent governments? Are governments entitled to circumscribe the options of their successor governments? This is a moral question. And so in the end, where do I end up? Is democracy and development the two best choices? Let me end by recalling something that a not so popular man these days, not so popular in India anymore, Winston Churchill, had once said. He said, "It has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all others that have been tried. Democracy truly cannot succeed unless those who express their choice are prepared to choose wisely. The real safeguard of democracy is therefore education and informed electoral choices, uninfluenced and unbiased by the manipulation of our mind and by the manipulation of our free electoral choice, by an excessive interference of social media in our lives." Thank you very much for enabling me this opportunity.
Thank you so much, sir. It was an absolute treat to listen to your speech. And now the house is open. We would request our participants if they have any questions and to interact with Mr. N.K. Singh. Please use the microphone.
Use the mic, please.
Yeah, so, sir, you spoke extensively about the impact of social media on a country's economy, decision-making, and politics. We saw Facebook founder deposed before US about a couple of months back. And the way I understand, the impact of social media is going to increase further. So China has a special policy for social media as such. So in your opinion, what should be the policy that we'll be having in terms of ring-fencing social media as far as India is concerned?
So, you know, why are you only talking about China? You read a few months ago of that huge controversy on how on the Facebook, Cambridge Analytica had obtained vast amounts of information about the conduct of people and what they did and the sort of people who accessed the use of that Cambridge Analytica for electoral purposes. So I really believe that, that I think to some extent, it's in the speech if you read, we do expect the people who handle this to exercise prudence and choice in using these vast instruments in a purposive manner which contributes to overall social harmony and social good. And therefore, I think that the first option must be for these large entities to exercise the power which they have now come to enjoy in a manner which would be socially conducive.
Mr. Jalan, this side.
Good afternoon, sir. This is Prashant Jalan. Well, in my view, not having simultaneous elections, as in the center and the states together, is a national waste. So that's my statement, sir. It's my personal statement. Would like to know your views.
Well, you know, I think that what is being done is the correct approach. Leaving aside my personal view, the fact remains that you recognize that for this to come about, you require a consensus among political parties, because it's not by one act of parliament, it would be multiple acts of parliament. You'll be changing the contours in which the governance rubric of this country is going to be altered. What happens, for instance, then, that if you do that, to ask you a hypothetical question, that what happens if a government falls on account of the absence of majority? Does that government carry on? Do you elect another government? Who is that another government which you elect? These require, therefore, more deliberation to come up with a multiple sort of changes, and our entire electoral laws for which a consensus is needed. But I think that a very healthy trend has begun of the Law Commission undertaking extensive consultations, not only with political parties, but the Election Commission of India would have to come into play. And let us see, hopefully a consensus will be reached, which in some form has the benefits of continuity, stability, and also economizing on resources. And let me add to something which doesn't express my personal view, but let me add a anecdotal experience to supplement what you are saying. You know, way back in 1991, I hope you were born, 1991 and 1992, when I was negotiating with the IMF and the World Bank, when India was passing through this huge balance payments crisis. We were kind of living on a day-to-day basis, and I would, in the Ministry of Finance, I would get a ring from the governor every week that by Saturday, 20 million, by Monday, 30, which meant that if I didn't deliver 20 or 30, India would default on its debt. So it was a question, it was that sort of scenario. Now, in that scenario, I was negotiating something called the Upper Credit Tranche Agreement with the IMF and a structural adjustment loan with the World Bank. I was in Washington negotiating that. And so my job was to get as much money yielding as little as possible, and standard brief for any diplomat. Get the maximum bang for your buck. So I was doing that, And then for everything that I'm a guy would suggest to me, a gentleman, a German gentleman called Hubert Nies, I would say, you know, I don't think we can do that because we have a vice president's election coming on within 2 months. So I see. What about then this 2 months? That time, 2 of our major states will be going for elections, and we would need to be very careful on doing that. And as the story went on right from Panchayat elections on to it, he finally got pretty fed up with me. And he said, hey, cut out all this. Tell me which are those 30 days when you wouldn't be having some election or the other in India, and I will select that 30 days to press you for something. So, I mean, since then we have traveled. And there was another gentleman, a German executive director in the World Bank, a gentleman called Goose. He was all the time trying to cook our goose because he was trying to impose a terrific lot of conditions. So he said, you know, let me give you one advice, and I was pretty young at that time. He said, young man, you know, India is like an injured tiger. It had just come out of its cage. It's roaming around very freely. Now, don't try and do all this to put it back to the cage. It'll go back to sleep again. I said, no, I assure you we won't. Look at the far-reaching changes from where we came from. In 91, every week I was delivering to Governor Venkatramanan $20 million. Today, we are in effortless position to be able to defend our currency against excessive volatility. And by the way, in the hundreds of eons of time, for a young nation like us, 25 years is not such a long time to go. Please remember what the scenario was then. So I think that it's a fair question. The dialogue is evolving.
Mr. Pallav Gupta.
Hello. Hello.
Yeah.
Sir, it's totally a different type of question I'm raising. I understand your predicaments. You've got tight commitments for meeting the various political parties again tomorrow, and the state government will be putting a lot of pressure, and we know that it's becoming in the press for quite some time. I'm just want to know your views on the current economic scenario in the country, because today I was reading some of the press releases. One is, of course, the inflation rate increasing. I think the WPI, the wholesale inflation itself is going up to over 5% now, which means the consumer inflation would be higher, and to that extent there will be difficulties on the interest rate scenario, the fiscal deficit position of the government. There would be a lot of pressure because of, again, the ensuing elections next year. So it's going to be fairly tricky from now on for the next 1 year. So your views and observations and on the strategic approaches which we need at this juncture.
Well, no, I think that's a very fair question because these days I'm not writing columns because my present position somewhat constrains me from not being able. But let me say this, that we are not in the same sweet spot in which we were some years ago. Nonetheless, there is enough tailwind in the economy driven by unsatiated large consumption, which is, I think, is a long way to go. We have, I think, we will effortlessly be able to maintain a 7.4, 7.6% rate of growth. The effort is to get to 8 quickly and then climb on because there is enough reforms which have been done in the economy driven by a young population, driven by consumption, driven by a large and growing market, given by the fact that after all the risks have been hedged, there is still a huge appetite for direct foreign investment in India. as you begin to look at the alternative scenarios of where else money can go in different competing destinations, sure, there are 2 or 3 headwinds which you have to confront. One is what you describe as interest arbitrage. The fact remains that interest rates in the US are going up because the Fed has decided to unwind its what may be called the policy, unconventional monetary policy. And therefore interest rates are likely to go up also because of a sharp cut in the corporate rate tax by President Trump. The fiscal deficit in the United States has gone up. So, and therefore a lot of the outward capital flows have not only got reversed, the attractiveness of US given its interest rates, its predictability, its low corporate rates really is one of the factors which is going to pull a lot of capital back. And this of course has automatic pressures on the exchange rate volatility of various other countries. I had suggested quite some time ago therefore that in the G20 dialogue which takes place, there should be some harmonization of policy between the central banks of the G20 countries. But one of the replies I received from an important central banker of an important central country, a developed country, is look, our laws are made for the government of the country. They are not made to act in top. But nonetheless, I think that if you see, we are in a much stronger macroeconomic position today than we were in 2013. You recall the taper tantrum of 2013. You remember how the exchange rate had gone in for a 6. Compared to that, look at the positives. The fact that today fiscal deficit, you know, my committee's report on the Fiscal Responsibility Management Act has been substantially accepted in the last budget. We have a much tighter fiscal regime than we have ever had. We have now a monetary policy committee which has a parliamentary ratification that interest rates, that inflation would be reined in the band of 4% plus minus 2%. That enjoined therefore fiscal policy to act in tandem with monetary policy. So there are very strong macro fundamentals. Now, is it all hanky-dory? Sure, no. For 3 reasons, I'll quickly say. One, we don't know the exogenous variables and uncertainties. We don't know what the hell is going to happen in the geopolitics. We don't know what the behavior of the oil price is likely to be. Is the worst over? Will we be able to arrive at an arrangement, for instance, to give an example on Iran, which doesn't upset the US in some reasonable way and doesn't bring consequences for our companies? Who knows? We don't know all this. We don't know also how the geopolitics on oil is going to evolve in a particular direction. Or for instance, the uncertainties of other kinds which are there apart from oil, being uncertainties on trade. Is it a pseudo trade war? Is it a genuine trade war? Is it a genuine repudiation of the World Trade Organization? Is it a genuine going back with everything that the US itself has taught the rest of the world? What the hell did they teach us for 30, 40 years? They taught us, Sonny, don't believe in your self-reliance, believe in being part of the most competitive global value-added chain. Forget about whether you can produce it or not. If you can produce one screw, that rest will come from South Africa, then it will be done here, then it will go to China, it will be finished up in Japan, it will be sold in the market. So that's what they taught us, to be part of a competitive global value-added chain. But no, not now. I do not believe in multilateral institutions too much. I don't believe in a very liberalized trading order. How much of this is of a lasting value, and how much of this is a transient phenomena? Is a trade war between the US and the Chinese, is it saber rattling? Or for instance, some skirmish between us and the US, is it just some sort of a thing to arrive? So what I mean is there are uncertainties. And of course, you talked about the elections. So far, let me tell you, every evidence that the leadership has given it does not wish to upset the apple cart of macroeconomic stability. The Prime Minister's speech 10 days ago made at the infrastructure conference in Bombay had one categorical statement, which is ring: I believe in long-term fiscal consolidation. We will not adopt a policy of fiscal profligacy. Period. That defines to you the fact that the electoral giveaways are not something which is in the top of the current leadership's mind. Now, there is the electoral uncertainty. There are 4 important state elections to take place in the next 2-3 months. We don't know. No soothsayer should pretend to know the electoral mind, etc., etc. These are uncertainties. But by and large, I think that we may or may not be in the sweet spot, but we are still in a happy spot.
Thank you. Yeah, that's it.
Hello. Good evening, Mr. N.K. Singh. I'm Kajal Banerjee from Millennium Mams. Taking your cue from freedom that comes with elective democracy, with the spending autonomy of the states combined with the ability to borrow that has obstructed efforts at consolidating public finances, please throw some light on it.
I thought that I dealt with this in a way because it involves intergenerational choices, doesn't it? If I do decide, if I know that the groundwater aquifer is going to support an X rate of exploitation for the next 30 to 40 years, would it be legitimate for me to overexploit it to get maximum amount of mileage for the 5 years that I am in office and thereby leave the groundwater aquifer substantially depleted? If I know that a particular intensity, like in use of particular modes of transport, will leave a fossil fuel footprint which will add to pollution dramatically, then is it legitimate for me to adopt that kind of a policy which would compromise the lives of my children or my grandchildren in a very fundamental way? Or for instance, is it legitimate for me to indulge in a kind of fiscal profligacy in which my successors would find it difficult to discharge the debt obligations? After all, not everybody may want to believe in the famous saying which was once said about a particular gentleman, "Blessed be thee, for thou shalt inherit my debt," because it was not really the happiest kind of a remark to give. So I think these are choices which we have to consciously make, and we are enjoined to make responsible choices which are responsible to improving the life quality of the present people and yet not be unfair in the distribution of resources and life quality in an intergenerational way.
Good evening, sir. I'm Preeti Mehta from Millennium Mams as well. My question is, very recently, World Bank declared India as the 6th largest economy, in spite of the fact the per capita income is very low. So I just wanted, out of curiosity, to ask that on what basis does the World Bank decide the ranking?
I presume that since you are working for such a prestigious organization, you perhaps quite afford with macroeconomic modeling. And therefore, I think that depending on the variables you choose, you can choose, for instance, one variable about which we know very little, total factor productivity. And how will productivity behave? How, for instance, will incremental capital output ratio behave, depending on the assumptions you make? Will technology be a disruptor? And if it is a disruptor, will it add to total factor productivity of capital, for instance, in a particular way? Depending on the nature of assumptions which you make, also because I think that the kind of assumption you make in what may be called purchasing power parity, PPP is a particular thing. PPP is currently about 4.5 or something, the worth of $1 in which you can do that. But the fact remains that if you look at something, if you remember something which I said, that my very good friend Lawrence D. Summers, he is the he's professor of economics at Harvard. He was the youngest president of Harvard. He became president of Harvard at the age of 42. He was US Treasury Secretary and chief economist of the World Bank and so on. When he last came to India, he told me a very interesting thing, which many of us should reflect and say. He said, you know, NK, many kinds of revolutions have taken place in, let us say, in the last 100 years. But I think that the one big revolution which is not getting noticed and written enough is if India continues to grow at about 8% per annum, then by the sheer power of compounding of that value, it will double per capita income in less than a decade. And if you look at the number of Indians, 1.34 billion people, doubling their per capita income in less than a decade, he believes this is one of the unsung revolutions of the last 100 years. So I really think that in terms of the fact that if we are growing at 7.6 or so or 8 on a long-term basis without getting disrupted, that's a very big fundamental change.
We also have friends from media. May we request Udit, who represents Times of India.
Hi. So I have one question, sir, that some states like southern states, Punjab, Bengal have objected about this shifting of base year to 2011 in the 15th Finance Commission as per proposal of the 14th Finance Commission, because they say their development will be less if 2011 is taken. So what is your take on that?
That's a very fair question. I'm not surprised that you would wish to ask this. Well, I have 3 comments to make. First and foremost, if you read all the memorandum which has been submitted by the finance ministers of the 4 southern states, they are not directed to the Finance Commission, they are directed to the President of India. Because they are not about the Finance Commission, they are about the terms of reference of the Finance Commission. And in one of the terms of reference of the Finance Commission, the President has stipulated that if wherever we use population, we should use the population census of 2011 and not 1972, which was used earlier. Now this is part of our terms of reference, with which we have nothing to do, but we have to address this terms of reference. And therefore those finance ministers and chief ministers have correctly addressed their representation and their demand to the President to alter this particular thing to the terms of reference. As far as we are concerned, we have to abide by the terms of reference that the President gives us. We are not the authors of the terms of reference, but we certainly have to address the terms of reference in which they are. So this is my first comment. My second comment is that while this says that we shall use 2011 census, if we choose to use population or wherever we choose to use population, there is a particular component in the terms of reference which says that we may consider incentivizing those states which have achieved good and rapid progress on replacement rates and achieving demographic management. So it expects that we will take note of this particular suggestion and also therefore look at incentives for states which have achieved quicker progress on population replacement. Third, while historically speaking, right from 1952, when the first Finance Commission, incidentally I should point out that the Bengal has had an important role to play in Finance Commission, because the first Finance Commission was headed by illustrious, distinguished Bengali, K.C. Niyogi. Actually, the Finance Commission, Interim Finance Commission between 1949 and 1952 was led by C.D. Deshmukh, but the first regular one was by K.C. Niyogi. And that is why, as part of our tribute to him, the conference room in the Finance Commission, I've decided to name it as the K.C. Niyogi conference room, but that is on an aside. Now, right from 1952,
in the horizontal distribution, we have to do two functions, as you know, primary three functions, the Finance Commission. Since I have to, you have provoked me to speak on the Finance Commission. One is that under the Constitution, we have to decide how much money the central government can keep and how much money will go to states. This is something loosely called the vertical distribution. Vertical between the central government and the states. The second function which you have to do is what you raised, the horizontal distribution, namely having decided how much money should go to the states, which state should get how much of that kitty. On that and on what criteria. Now, right from 1952, population has been used as an important variable in deciding the horizontal distribution. Of course, the weights given to population have varied from a small weight of 10-15% to a big weight like 40%. Nothing in the terms of reference prevents this Finance Commission of according weights to population which incentivizes efficiency and yet recognizes equity. The balance between efficiency and equity is a central piece on which the work of this Finance Commission must be judged. It will be our endeavor to reward performance, but also recognize the need for equity. And finally, in the last Finance Commission, it was said that that Finance Commission should use the 1972 figures, but it chose to use a mix of 1972 and 2011. It did so even though the terms of reference did not ask it to do so, by giving 17% marks to the 1972 population figures and 10% marks to the population figure of 2011. So, the weightage, the mix, the award of incentive to states which have achieved replacement rates, and the manner in which this is calibrated, it will be the endeavor of this Commission to ensure that an appropriate balance and a fair judgment is reached between rewarding performance and recognizing the need for equity. In the end, we are governed and we will be governed by no other biases or prejudices except governed by what the Constitution governs us and enables us to do. We're governed by the Constitution and by our conscience.
Any other questions from our media friends? Yeah.
I am from ABP, Rugganandu. Sir, you in your just speech you mentioned about legacy, and you also mentioned about the debt. Exactly what you said, this is happening in West Bengal also. West Bengal government is claiming that they are suffering due to the debt accrued by the previous government. But simultaneously, due to servicing the debt as well as from other development purpose, the present government is also borrowing. Suppose in the next, for just given, suppose in the next election this government is voted out, the next government that will come, that will it will default to them. Then what is the remedy?
Well, no, I wish I knew the answer. It's $1 million question. Because I'll tell you why. By the way, I didn't have the present government only in mind. Let's give you another example, which is really at the top of my mind. I mean, take the case of loan waivers. Who pays for loan waivers? You and I do. What happens if a government which believes it is not likely to be in office necessarily for 5 years undertakes an important decision like a loan waiver and then goes out of office? Who bears the burden of that loan waiver? The successor government does. This is the logic of things. This is the logic of democracy. There is no other way in which it can be done. Decisions taken by regularly, normally, legitimately elected governments have that right to take those decisions, but they have an obligation to exercise judgment, appropriateness and balance. this is what the mandate prescribes. Let me therefore put the thing to you a little more sharply. You know, I'll put it anecdotally to you. The last job, before this job which I had, was to chair a committee which laid down India's fiscal roadmap, called the Fiscal Responsibility Management Act, if you recall. And that Fiscal Responsibility Management Act has been substantially now accepted in the last budget and now forms the now Fiscal Responsibility Management Act. That act, broadly speaking, says that the ideal debt to GDP ratio for a country like India, given our level of per capita income and our level of development as not yet a middle income country, but hoping to be a middle income country, would really give you an ideal debt to GDP of 60%, of which 40% debt for the central government and 20% debt for the states. This is what I said in the report. This has got accepted. This is reflected now in the last budget speech of the Honorable Finance Minister and so on. Now, when the first round of loan waivers came, it didn't come now. If you remember, it came some time ago when UP, immediately after the new government was elected, went in for a big loan waiver, right? So at that time, I was not in this present sort of job of being the chairman of the Finance Commission. I asked this question how would the central government accommodate the consequences of what UP has decided on a major loan waiver? And the answer I received was very sobering, that the central government has no role to play. If the UP government can pay for the loan waiver, good luck to the UP government. But there is one catch, and that's the catch, and that's the handle. That catch is that for the first time, if you read the terms of reference of this commission, which is unique to this commission, it asks us to also lay down the broad framework, terms and conditions of the use of Article 293(3) of the Constitution. Now, what does this Article 293(3) of this Constitution say? It says that till such time as any state government owes any money in any form, one way or the other, to the central government, then the permission of the central government must be taken for the state government to contract any borrowing. Right? So for the first time, we have been asked to lay down the conditions under which the central government should consider according permission, or denying permission, one way or the other, under 293(3) of the Constitution. Now, what does that therefore mean? It means therefore that, for instance, to give an example, like UP or Karnataka wants to borrow more and has hit the ceiling of borrowing laid down under its own FRBM Act, the central government can say, if it wishes to say, that look here, Sonny, you have busted your ceiling, and I'm unable to give the permission. In the past, it hasn't happened. And that is why I must say that full marks to the current political leadership, that they have put that to depoliticize this decision. What do I mean by depoliticize this decision? In other words, that if the state government which is there in office is on good terms or a good wicket with the government which is there, maybe a more generous view will be taken than the state government which is not. Now, this is therefore injecting a political bias or predilection in what should be purely an economic decision. Now, the fact that we are being asked to lay the framework suggests a very transparent mindset of the Prime Minister, particularly in asking for transparent conditions to be laid down on the use of Article 293(3). So, does it answer your question?
Yes. Any other friend from the media? Just please use the mic. Yeah.
I'm Udit. So for, as you said, the laid down the condition for the state which have some borrowing with the center. So in case that state's going for market borrowing, then also there will be some guidelines laid down by this thing to take permission from center, and if that borrowing is within the FRBM mark as per the GSDP of that state, do they need to take permission from center?
Look here, if it is within the FRBM ceiling, more or less the permission is automatic. The situation only arises when you go outside the ceiling. If you remember, the last Finance Commission, and by the way, this is not something that the center is imposing. All state governments, including the last two, Sikkim and West Bengal, who came in last, have now enacted state fiscal responsibility management bills. They have taken, with the permission of the legislatures, conditions under their own FRBM Act, not an FRBM Act imposed by any outside force or outside component. If they are within the FRBM, then, I mean, this is no-brainer that also the last Finance Commission, if you remember, that for states which have eliminated fiscal deficit or whose behavior in the previous 2 financial years have been of a particular kind, were given an allowance of 0.25% over the 3% in terms of being able to borrow. So it's very clear that we are talking only when the FRBM restriction. And why is that so, by the way? It is so because ultimately, if you are wanting to be in a debt trajectory, because the world doesn't treat India separate from the states. The world treats you for the general government, which is the center and the states. And therefore, it looks at the overall debt picture of the general government. And that overall debt picture of the general government must be in the ballpark of around 60% or so. Of course, it doesn't automatically mean that you compress the thing in 1 year to be able to achieve that, but it does mean that you have to make a movement in that direction. Let me also say that it's a false acquisition. It's a false acquisition that the only culprits are the states. No. The central government has been as much derelict as has been states. In fact, there have been periods when the states have been much better in terms of behavior and compliance. I'll give you an example. Who pressed the pause button on the FRBM? It was the central government for the first time. Who decided that in 2007 and 8 you required fiscal accommodation? It was the central government. So, I mean, in all this thing that I have said, please don't read any attribute that this is directed at the states. No, it is directed as much at the central government as with the states, because both have to act in tandem and in partnership to really make this a genuinely working federation. The pain and the gains must be evenly divided in terms of better quality of macroeconomic management, of which both the central government and the state government are equal partners.
Okay, can we have the mic here? And after this, we'll take one more if there is.
Good evening, sir. Going back to the topic of the day, you mentioned, sir, that Sir Winston Churchill had said that democracy is the worst form of governance. India is supposed to be a sovereign democratic republic, which I believe translates into equal rights and opportunities for all. Is it really so, sir? Because even Nelson Mandela, when he was going to come into power, had very clearly stated that he wanted no compromise where merit was concerned in the form of reservation. Democracy, as we know in India, I feel is a deterrent to development. Your comments, your take on that, sir.
Well, first and foremost, I think you partially quoted Churchill, because let me complete that quotation, right? So that was a buttress your argument. I don't blame you, because let me complete that quotation in which he said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all others which have been tried. So I think that in a sense, therefore, would have been the correct. Now, you asked the question that do terrible decisions get made for extraneous considerations in a democratically elected government. I will not like to pass a value judgment on whether the decisions are terrible or decisions are meritorious. But let me say that if we have reposed faith in a system and a form of government which is enshrined in our constitution, then we have ab initio, through adult franchise, free and fair election, accepted the consequences of the constitution which we have adopted.
The last question? Yeah. Prashant Sharma, would you like to have a bit? Yeah. We'll just take last two. Yeah, sure, please.
Good evening, sir. This is Alka Poddar from Millennium Mams. Going back to today's topic, democracy and development, you said measuring development is measuring freedom of choices, which is a key ingredient of democracy. Sir, how do we explain the development of China, which is not truly a democracy, or they give truly freedom of choices, but still when you see their per capita income is growing, and currently I visited China last month and spoken to a lot of people from the lower strata of society, and their happiness quotient is not bad. They are very happy with their governance and their democracy, as they call it, the Chinese way of democracy. Thank you, sir.
Well, you know, let me say this. I have been going to China also quite frequently. And I would like to be in India. I would like to be in China. I would like to be as imperfect as we are, but exercising freedom of choice, freedom of thought, freedom of speech. This really, for me, really brings about the quintessential development of human personality. And this is in the index of happiness. If you really compute the index of happiness and you take a representative sample, it is societies which permit this kind of latitude and freedom, which in the long run make societies happier and more cohesive. I'm not saying that China hasn't done a remarkable job. It has done a breathtaking job. Its per capita income, look here, let's not forget the fact, and this is to support you, let's not forget the fact that, let's say if you read Angus Deaton's ceramic work on history of economic development through centuries, then till about 1600, India and China together represented 2/3 of the global GDP. Why 1600? Till about 1962, per capita income in India was a touch higher than the per capita income in China. The real change began to take place when, from around the beginning of the 74, China embarked on controlled market liberalization, and India got clobbered away till 1991 in an excessively controlled model. They have a lead time on us of about 20 years or so. We're catching up, but they began in 1974 in course correction. We began our course correction in 1991. I'm writing my autobiography, and one of the things I'm writing, one section, is why did we take so long till 1991 to do a course correction, and why did we fail to do the course correction in the 70s when the Chinese had done. Wait for my book. I may have a bizarre explanation for it, but you'll find it interesting.
The last question, Prashant Sharma.
Good evening, sir. With the country's economy galloping the way it is, and the growth which we see in the coming decade or two, corporate debt availability and rates have gone down from 24, 30%, 24%, 18%, and now it's hovering to a single digit unitary number. How do you see this in the coming decade, or maybe if it's a long shot, then 2 decades? Availability and the rates both.
Well, clearly, I think that the managing the stressed corporate debt situation, which is linked with the efficiency and solvency of the Indian public sector banks, is central to rekindling our growth momentum. It is, in my view, I should have added, not a headwind which is exogenous, but it is certainly a big drag which is endogenous. Now, I think that some decisive steps have been taken recently in terms of the Insolvency Act, in terms of setting up the NCLT. We should have done it earlier, but there is now a complete recognition of what the problem is, and the problems look to be really quite large, and I think that that needs to be expeditiously dealt with, because till the banks are freed up, a lot of the corporates are caught up in that, and the banks need to be assured that in taking deep haircuts, which may be necessary, why they took such bad decisions is another matter and another session, and whether we were excessively trapped in 2 decades of what is called telephone banking, namely as the right guys rang up the right people, then the quality of due diligence was deeply compromised and projectization was deeply compromised. That's for another subject, but certainly that issue, I think, needs to be fundamentally resolved. Now, we will certainly, in order to get to an 8-9% growth trajectory, we will definitely require much larger levels and much greater savings investment and investment gearing ratio to take you to that. So currently, unfortunately, what has happened is after reaching 33-34%, the savings ratio has come down, partly because the household savings has come down substantially. We hope that the savings ratio is able to pick up in India to take us to 32-33%. Because one of the great things about India and why we are not scared of our debt to GDP today in India is roughly about 69.4 or 69.5% or so, way above the 60% which I mentioned to you. 9 percentage point and 1 percentage point of GDP is about 160,000 crore. You multiply 160,000 crore into 9, that will give you the extent of misalignment which exists. So, to come back to it, the only satisfaction which we have is that the bulk of our debt is domestic debt. If it was foreign debt, boy oh boy, we would have been in a first class situation right now. So we need to certainly improve the savings investment ratio, and we need to reduce corporate savings. We need to enhance the savings of the household segment. How do you reduce the corporate savings? One of the things which you need to certainly do is the public sector companies need to perform much better. Public sector banks need to perform much better. This will improve the government savings substantially. And what are the other instruments to increase the rates of return to incentivize household savings is a subject, I think, which deserves closer attention.
Thank you so much, sir. I believe the gathering today have received some of the most satisfying answers of their question from the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission. And now I would request Dr. Rajiv Singh to deliver the vote of thanks.
Sir, I don't think we can thank you enough. It's very rare to have people like you sharing your knowledge, experience, wisdom with so much of clarity and patience. So on behalf of the audience, members, I would like to express our heartfelt thanks to you for sparing your time and sharing your views on very diverse subjects. So I would like to request all of you to please carry this vote of thanks with a huge round of applause, and maybe with a standing ovation to the Finance Commission Chairman. Thank you, sir. Thank you. It's really wonderful to have you.
And now I would request Dr. Rajiv Singh to kindly hand over a humble memento to Mr. N.K. Singh. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a arrangement for refreshments in the registration area. So we would request all of you to kindly join us for the high tea. Thank you.